Wisconsin Eye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
Wisconsin Eye is in Eau Claire on the campus of the Chippewa Valley Tech College. We're interviewing State Representative Chris Danou of Trempealeau. He's a Democrat seeking re-election in Assembly District 92. Chris, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
Thank you.
Programming note, Wisconsin Eye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. Chris, you were a member of the Speaker's Task Force on Rural Schools, right?
That's correct.
Well, they came forth with, I think, 12 recommendations. None of them passed. Which are you going to, if you're reelected, which are most important to push for next session?
Well, I mean, of those recommendations, boy, those were in some senses relatively small recommendations. My feeling is if we were serious about fixing the problems, we'd go right at the heart of the school funding formula. I realize that's very politically difficult, but we're expected to do politically difficult things. I think the other, if I could say specifically of those specifics, I think the sparsity formula changes, I think, to increase sparsity aid and some of those categorical aids. Unfortunately, the problem with categorical aids is because they're based around a formula, sometimes they don't drop into the right places for you. That's why I really think we need to step in and take a, if it was up to me, I'd step back and redo the formula from start to finish.
Okay, let's talk about how you would redo the formula.
Well, the first thing, I think that one of the most key components is you need an income. You need to have something in the formula to take account of the income of the folks that live in the district. That data is there, we can find it. You need to basically, because property wealth can be deceptive. In a lot of the districts I represent, you have high levels of property wealth, but relatively low numbers of students. And the actual incomes of the people that live there, that truly live there, is quite low. The Alma School District is a good example. You have some fairly valuable farmland combined with fairly valuable scenic recreational land in large parts of my district with low student counts. And so what happens is the district on a per pupil basis actually looks wealthy when the actual incomes are not reflected in that property wealth. And I think that would be one of the key components, is to take into account the actual incomes of the people that live in that district as opposed to just property wealth. And then make the adjustments based on a lot of that.
One more question on this subject.
Sure.
What's at stake for rural schools? If they're not helped, what do they look like in 5, 7, or 8 years?
Oh, I think you're going to see waves of consolidations and shutdowns potentially. I think some of them simply will no longer continue to function, and when that will happen, you will see the school districts will be forced to consolidate with neighboring school districts or dissolve. Dissolution can be even worse, because then what happens is often the students will get parceled up among multiple neighboring districts. You know, my big fear is when you lose a school, you lose the community. When you have these small communities and they no longer have a school there, that means it's sort of almost like there's not a future. You're not going to convince young families to relocate to that community, convincing businesses to locate there, you know, retail businesses. When you look across the state and you've seen the consolidations that have happened, you've seen the communities that actually lose the school, it usually spells the long-term end of that community. It will hang on, but the community generally ceases to grow. Those schools are such a vital function, and they're really the centerpiece of most rural communities. The sports, the community events, the social events, you kill the schools, you kill the community.
A big part of next session's debate, if you're reelected, will be the future of voucher and choice schools. Your position?
Oh, I'm opposed to those. I mean, every dollar that goes into the voucher program is a dollar that comes out of the public schools. It's right off the top. I mean, so basically every dollar that goes to a voucher school is $1 less that the public schools I represent don't have. Even if you accepted that vouchers work, and clearly the evidence is clear that their performance levels are either no better or even not as good as the public schools, they're not going to come into a district into the school districts like mine that are having graduating classes of 50, 60 kids, or sometimes as little as a dozen. There's no money to be made by them there. They're not going to come into a district like that. So those kids, it's not like those kids will even have the option of a voucher school. And when you look that basically 3/4 of the people that use the vouchers were already in private schools, all you're doing is subsidizing the people that already want their kids in the private school system. So it's not like you're truly offering them a choice. And in my district, there is no real choice. You have to have good schools.
Thank you. Governor Walker this summer asked that Wisconsin withdraw from Common Core standards. Your position?
I have some skepticism about high-stakes testing that often revolves around a lot of these standards. But again, the school districts all over the state spent a lot of time, energy, and money getting these standards put into place. Let's at least see how they work for a few years before we decide to withdraw. You know, I'm one of those guys that say, yeah, look, we've done something. Let's let the policy work, see how it goes, and if there are problems, make adjustments and move forward. To sort of do this knee-jerk reaction, we're going to get out of Common Core. The school districts I've talked to, you know, they're already strapped for money, spent a lot of time and money to do the implementation. And all of a sudden you're going to throw these standards out. I think it's quite frankly, it's a political ploy, you know, to basically throw a bone to the tinfoil hat brigade for the most part. I think there's some concerns, but the concerns that have been motivating the right-wing opposition to these are really not ones that are based in fact or reality.
As a former police officer, I want to ask you this. Impact of the Act 10 exemptions for police officers and firefighters. 3 years later, what's been the impact? Well,
in some senses, they were able to keep their collective bargaining rights, but they had to pay additional monies. I know from talking to my former colleagues, they had to pay out more in insurance premiums and retirement costs and those things. So they did take a hit on their take-home pay as well. I think the fear that a lot of police and fire have is that it will eventually come for them too, and I think they're wise to be concerned about that.
Should it come for them?
Look, I think Act 10 should be repealed. I didn't support it. I don't want it. For those employees that are able to retain their collective bargaining rights, all the more power to them. I think my focus is to give collective bargaining rights back to people that lost them. That'd be my focus. I don't want to. I'm not somebody who gives to the idea that because somebody else is in pain, you need to be in pain. You need to make, because I'm in pain, you need to make somebody else in pain as well. I think that's unfortunately that's the attitude that they used with Act 10 to play on that, and that's not something I support.
The explosion of frac sand mining in western Wisconsin seems to be a debate in the Capitol. Some people want minimal standards set by state government. Others say it's purely a local control issue. Your position?
Well, I think we really do need to revisit how we manage non-metallic mining. If you look at the standards that were set, the standard was set getting close to 20 years ago, maybe even longer now. I don't know right off the top of my head. But it was really designed and put into place for these much smaller quarrying sand, you know, the typical sand and quarries that were much, much smaller in scale relative to the large sand operations that you're seeing now. You know, these are the more the quarries, you know, for road building, for construction, those sorts of things. You know, they're typically be 20, 30, 40 acres in size, you know, on the, you know, somewhere, whereas you're talking very, very large operations on a heavy industrial scale. I do think we need to sit down and look and say, do we need to revisit those and make sure that the standards are there? We just had some heavy, serious fines handed out to some mines in my district that weren't doing what they were supposed to. So, you know, that's my number one concern, is to make sure that we protect public health and safety. And if we need to strengthen some of the regulations, fine. We do need to make sure that local communities have the ability to have some real say in what some of those standards are, though, too.
Transportation funding. There's a new projection that the transportation fund in the next biennium, $600 million, $700 million short. How should that shortfall be made up?
I think we need to look at everything. I certainly don't agree with the approach of commissioning a big study and then essentially shelving everything. I think we're going to need to look at doing something to increase revenue to go towards roads, whether it be tolling, whether it be, you know, going back to indexing, some of those things. I think, to me, one of the more logical ones is if we can get the federal government to agree, which I think they would, it'd be to go to some sort of open road tolling, similar to what Illinois has. I mean, you're not going to have plazas and tollways anymore like that people find so troubling. I travel to Illinois visiting relatives on a regular basis. I throw an iPass on my car and it's no big deal. I think we're going to have to look at something. The upside of doing that is then you're essentially gathering the money from those who utilize the roads the most. When we lost indexing, as a good example, we gave up a lot of money that's from people that were actually using the roads from Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, that is now being made up for by the people only of the state of Wisconsin. So we're going to have to take a serious look at that, I think. And we got to look at it, and it's essentially probably going to some level of a user fee, because that's the fairest way to do it typically.
Let's talk about health care. As you know, 1 in 5 Wisconsin residents get their health care through our Medicaid program. The American Hospital Association says our reimbursement rates are second lowest.
Yep.
Should they be increased?
Oh, sure. You know, it's funny. I was just meeting this past week, and prior to being here, I was meeting with some directors of some of my nursing home and assisted living facilities and critical care facilities, and you know, they're telling me about those very concerns. I mean, they're losing $30 to $40 a day on a typical patient that they're seeing, or a typical client, and you know, they can't sustain that. I mean, if that's what the costs are, that's what the state needs to step up and help pay. I mean, it's that simple. All that happens is somebody else is making up for it somewhere else, and typically they're going after the private pay people, or and so the folks that are on the private pay are essentially helping to subsidize the fact that the state's not willing to step up. And that $200 million that the $200 million that the governor's foregone and Medicaid expansion certainly could go a long way towards fixing some of those reimbursement rates, I suspect.
That new Fiscal Bureau report that estimates that the potential deficit could be north of $1 billion in the next biennium. If there is a deficit, how should it be fixed? Well,
you have to fix it. You fix deficits typically. You look at cutting where you can cut smartly, and if you need to increase revenues somewhere, you need to increase revenues. The first thing you don't do, though, is you don't make ridiculous tax cuts based on projections. I didn't support all those things they did. I got up on the floor and said, you know, they're saying, well, we're going to cut because it's going to look good for politics. Well, I said, how about waiting and seeing if the projections actually show out to be true before we do this? I mean, that's the first. Partly we need to actually see what's really going to happen, but you don't make tax cuts before you really have the revenue. If you have a surplus, that's a problem I don't mind figuring out what to do with. You deal with a surplus, and then if you have a surplus, then if you want to give it back or put money in other programs, whatever. But start there as opposed to cutting money you don't have, and that'd be the first thing I would say.
The bill to legalize medical marijuana will be reintroduced next session. Now the states of Washington and Colorado have legalized recreational marijuana. Your position on those issues?
Well, I was a co-sponsor of the medical marijuana bill.
I thought you were.
The reason I would do that is because it was named after my constituent, Jackie Rickert. Yes. She actually lives in my district.
Of Mondovi.
Mondovi. And after hearing her story and what she's gone through, I was, how can I, you know, to have any sense of mercy and empathy, you have to support something like that for her. I think we have the advantage right now, though, as far as recreational marijuana, of stepping back, seeing what's going on in those two other states, see how it plays out, and go from there. I think so far the early returns are relatively good from what I'm hearing, especially as the amount of additional revenue it's generating for the state of Colorado. Washington's is really just getting up and going. I read a number of very interesting articles about that, and I'm of the opinion that that's something that we can afford to wait and see a little bit. And that's the beauty of operating sometimes at the state level, is you can kind of see how other states do with their experiments and watch, and if it seems like it's working, apply what you've learned and go from there. But I'd like to really see what happens in those two states over the next year or two before we really start to think about going down the road of legalization.
On a related subject, some people say that we have too many nonviolent criminals in prisons, and that some of those could be released. It would cost less than the prison system. Do you think that's possible?
I do think the focus when you put people in prison should be on people who are truly a danger to the community, or truly a danger to the community, the rapists, the murderers, the child abusers, the child molesters, guys like that. I live in western Wisconsin, where we've taken a pretty forward-looking approach to a lot of community corrections and alternatives to incarceration. It saves money, saves the local taxpayer money, saves the state money. I think we need to look at that. Now, I'm a former cop. I'm certainly not somebody who believes in, believe me, I dealt with some of these guys, and there's a lot of them who need to be locked up. I've dealt with other ones, though, who clearly what they need is a way to get a handle on their addictions and their mental health issues, and if we can get them those kinds of services, they probably won't be back into the system.
As a former officer, first offense drunken driving, should it be a crime?
I think the way it's working right now is probably the best. I've done enough with DAs and worked with them to know that, the way the court system works, it would bog things down incredibly. And I think you talk to most officers, they'd probably say that quite frankly, a first offense is one of those things that particularly in a state like Wisconsin, it probably happen to just about anybody. And you want to be careful before saddling a lot of people with a felony record or a potential felony. I think it's an extraordinarily expensive, to get a drunk driving arrest is going to cost you a lot of money, probably upwards by the time you pay insurance, the fines, legal fees. It's probably close to $10,000 it will take out of your wallet. And that's a pretty substantial penalty. plus the embarrassment, the community embarrassment. It's no longer socially acceptable. It's no, believe me, I arrested enough members of the community who were fairly well known to know that they were very, very embarrassed to be arrested for an OWI. And it's, so I think where we are now is probably where we need to be. I think where you really want to put your focus again is on the repeat offenders, the guys that are clearly not getting it. If a person's not an alcoholic and they get that first drunk driving arrest, they probably will never have it happen to them again. If they've got problems, they will probably find themselves back in the system, and those are the ones we really need to focus on, those repeat offenders. Obviously, if there's injury or death, then the consequences need to be more severe, which they are, but I think it's the best way to go.
Finally, you want to highlight any differences between you and your opponent on November 4?
Well, I think, the most important one in some senses, I think, is I actually live in the district I represent. He's claiming a residence in the district, which is fine, but he does not actually live there, I don't believe. You know, he's run for office in 3 different districts, or 2 different districts at least previously. His last place he voted in was the city of Menominee, which is actually 2 districts away in the April election. So, you know, I'm interested in representing the district. You know, that's the one thing I will say. I don't have an ideological axe to grind. My focus has always been on, if you look, when I take my votes, my focus has really been what's good for my district, what's good for the people I represent, even if it may not comport with what the B part, you know, what a typical Democrat would support. I've been supportive of some of the hunting and fishing issues that often aren't typically supported by Democrats. I supported, worked on the wolf hunting bill, the crossbow hunting bill, snowmobiling, you know, NRA votes, things, you know, I've been endorsed, I don't know if I've been endorsed and passed by the NRA. So, I mean, you know, I'm not afraid to look at what my district wants and go from there.
Thank you. Representative Chris Danou of Trempealeau is a Democrat seeking re-election in Assembly District 92. Chris, thanks for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Thank you.
Thank you.